David read the first book, Game of Thrones. I remember seeing them in his house, literally like a doorstop. There were 4 books, about 4,500 pages of writing, and going, what the hell is that sitting on your floor? And who could ever possibly read that many pages of anything? And I got the book, and I read 950 pages in 2.5 days.
As my friend D.B. Weiss, who's my partner on the series, said, they're like crack on paper.
We called George, and we thought it was going to be a difficult conversation because the books had been sent to consider for movies, and we wanted to do an HBO series. And it turned out it was a pretty easy conversation because George said, it's the only way I ever thought anyone could do it. They're too big for movies. And it turned out he was a huge fan of Rome and these other HBO series. So we ended up taking him out for lunch, and at the very end of the lunch, he turned to us and he said, so who is Jon Snow's real mother? And it was kind of clear that it was the test question that was going to decide. And oddly enough, Dan and I had been talking about it the day before, and that we had a theory, and we said our theory, and it turned out it was right, and from that point on, we were on board. Looking back on it, I guess it is stunning to think that they trusted us with, tens of millions of dollars to make season 1, because neither of us had any experience with producing. We were both experienced writers at that point, but zero producing experience, and ended up making a huge number of mistakes.
Well, I've always liked breaking conventions. I love the genres. I'm not one of these guys who's trying to burn everything down with a flamethrower. I love science fiction. I love fantasy. But I hate familiarity. I want it to surprise me.
There are certain well-established fantasy tropes in the book that we've seen before, the dragons and giants and demons and magic, but the characters felt like real people who just happened to live in a world where these supernatural things existed.
To my mind, the war between good and evil is not fought between armies of heroes in white cloaks and armies of really ugly guys in black cloaks, but rather is fought within the individual human heart in the choices that we make in times of crisis. I think all human beings have within them the capacity for good and the capacity for evil. I look at history, and all of the greatest heroes have flaws. All of the greatest villains have moments of humanity or redeeming qualities about them. And to my mind, that doesn't make them less interesting. That makes them more interesting. Good guys and bad guys is fun when you're 7, but you should look around and see what the world is like and grow more than that. And I wanted to weld fantasy with the historical fiction, and which is more gritty and realistic, and to capture some of what I see as the real moral ambiguity of these issues.
What certainly attracts me to this material, and I think attracts most of our fans, is that nothing is clear cut. Jamie is a perfect example, and Maisie Williams said something in an interview earlier. She said, Arya doesn't exist to be your favorite character, which I thought was an awesome thing to say. This is not the guy you're supposed to cheer because he's going on this clean redemptive arc. That's not the world we're playing in here. And
that's some of the most intrinsically interesting stuff to us, and it's what we have the room to explore on the show that maybe even the books don't get to go into.
My name is Arya Stark. I want you to know that. The last thing you're ever going to see is a Stark smiling down at you as you die.
A lot of that breaking story grunt work kind of happens on set, just in conversations between the 4 of us. And David and Dan kind of mapped out the broad strokes of a lot of where we're going to be going to the end game a few seasons ago. So those kind of signposts have always been there. In past years, we would go character by character first because everyone was so spread out. They kind of had, each character sort of had their own little show. This year we sort of approached it by the 3 sort of axes of the different people that are vying for the throne. So you've got the sort of the Cersei, the Dany, and the Jon sort of, sections.
And then we'll start writing an actual outline. Last year, Dave, what was it, like 130 pages, 140 page? 160 page outline for 10 episodes.
Once we figure out which scripts we're writing, Dave and Bryan will write their own script individually, and then we'll take the others, and Dan might write the first half, and I'll be writing the second half, and then we swap paths and rewrite each other.
But it takes usually about 2 to 3 weeks to write, the first draft. And then we're revising it pretty much up until shooting, although we have to have the scripts, the entire season written well before production begins.
Because the entire season is cross-boarded, meaning it's all shot like a movie. We might shoot scenes from the final episode in the first week, And there's so much prep involved that everything has to be written. I mean, we keep rewriting over the course of the season, but it all has to be written so that people know how to get it ready.
You know, we've been friends for 20 years, so there's less of a fear of offending. If Dan writes a line of dialogue that I think isn't working, I'll just write a note saying, I don't think this works.
And a long time ago, I broke all the books down kind of chapter by chapter and did some outlines and things of that nature to kind of lay the groundwork for what ended up being seasons 3 and 4 and beyond.
One of the greatest things about being in a writer's room is you're just insulated from those considerations and you put the dream version of it out there. And we always end up scaling things back. But at the end of the day, like, you're in there in the room and you're creating the version of the show or the vision of the show that's in your head that you would love to make if you had unlimited time, unlimited money, and you don't. So you end up paring that down. But it's always better to start with that, because then at least you know what you're shooting for.
We can hold them off.
It's arguable that sanitizing representations of violence is more harmful than more graphic depictions of violence that make you feel the way violence probably should make you feel, which is uncomfortable and horrified.
On network television, people will die in droves all the time. They just die in a way that is clean and easy to watch, and it makes it fun. I mean, if you want to start indicting violence in fiction, you have to go, you're indicting the cornerstones of our culture. You're indicting the Iliad, you're indicting the Bible, you're indicting Shakespeare. Things happen in the Bible that you could not show on HBO or anywhere.
We tried not to put it in a cartoony place, because that's not what the books did, that's not what history is about, and it just seems fundamentally dishonest.
The episodes started coming in for season 1 way under time. We were 93 minutes short for the entire season, so we had this kind of 2-week crunch. It was like exam time back in
churn
college.
out basically a script and a half's worth of added material dispersed throughout the season to make the episodes long enough.
The Jaime Cersei scene's an example. The scene with Viserys and Dorea in the tub is an example of that. The scene with Theon and Tyrion. All of these were written as we were shooting season 1. And they're some of the best scenes in the first season. They're all character, and they all explore the characters, and they explore the backstory and the themes, and they're a way of delving into that without using flashbacks and without using kind of cheesier narrative devices. It's one of those great things about making a TV show. If we hadn't run short, those scenes wouldn't have existed, and I think the first season would have been a lot less because of it. It was like, we have these 2 characters, there's stuff that they have to say as characters, there's stuff we as writers have to say about the world of the show that can be conveyed through these characters. Let's have them bump into each other in the throne room and see what happens.
Why not anyone? Why me?
You're my son.
Vulnerability is the key to any of these kinds of scenes, is finding those little inner wants and the little voice in any of these characters' heads, whether they're Sam or Cersei, the part that hates themselves that, we all have. You shouldn't be afraid to have your characters make mistakes and act selfishly and put them into dark places, but you've also got to, as a writer, understand why they're doing it and empathize with them, with every single one of them, and that includes the worst of them.
What they're doing from the outside seems kind of twisted and maybe wrong, but getting into it with them forces us to dig deeper with them and kind of create a way into their perspective and a way into them not being simplistic bad guys. Once you start to see them as people with human motivations, then there are all sorts of avenues you can explore with them that you couldn't explore if they were Ice Queen #1 and Evil Prince Valiant #1.
And I feel like they're all the heroes of their own story. When you're approaching the Cersei arc, you're writing her as the heroine of her story. I mean, in terms of a multi-season arc, you start with Joffrey's death, how that manifests itself in her undermining of House Tyrell, how that barrels into her arming the faith, how the faith turns the tables on her and she is then marginalized and has to take back what she thinks at this point is hers. I mean, that is a hero's journey in and of itself, and she's not a traditional hero, but I think when you're writing it, she's the protagonist.
Speaking of Breaking Bad, I mean, we based Tycho's kind of clipped mannerisms on Gus Fring. Whenever we can steal from Breaking Bad, we will, including their directors.
Sexposition refers to a scene where there's some kind of information dump and expository scene, but you're distracted from the exposition by the copious sex.
That's the thing, when you're writing it, though, it's the same thing. It's an element of the story.
George makes you fall in love
with his characters, and then the characters are all in constant jeopardy. And so it's an Arya chapter, and you're thinking it's actually possible, even though in a traditional fantasy book, a character like Arya would never get killed. Well, in these books, she could. So, we were just trying to mimic that in the TV series, and it does mean that you have to make these horrible sacrifices. Most of the TV series that we've loved over the years, even the best ones, I don't think they had a sense from the beginning where it's going to end up. You don't know how many seasons it's going to run, so the idea that you really know the beginning, the middle, and an end from that first meeting is insane. But with this story, we thought we had an opportunity to do that. It's the kind of story that just needs a long-term plan. Yeah, we've had a lot of arguments with writer friends about the whole notion of theme. And for me, theme is for 8th grade English papers. And themes emerge naturally from the story. And this is a story about power, and it always comes back to power. But it's not as if we're going into each scene thinking, now how can we make this scene be about our notions of power? At the end of the day, you can have your different fears and you can feel the pressure, but when you're sitting down at the computer to write, you can't have 1,000 different voices in your head saying, screaming at you like, no, you can't do that to Wolverine, or what are you? George Martin's book would never go to that place. You have to write what you think is best, and you have to really just have your voice in your head trying to come up with the next sentence. For me, what I hope for is endurance. That people still watch it and think about it and talk about it after it's done, and that it lingers in people's minds, and it's not just one of these pop culture phenomenons that's a big deal when it's happening, and then 2 years later everyone's forgotten about it.
Hello everyone, thanks for watching. On this channel, we are going to be learning how some of the best TV shows and films were created, hearing from the creators themselves. If this is something that would be interesting to you, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and join us as we take a look behind the curtain.